In October 2015, a Wall Street Journal investigation shattered the illusion. Theranos, once valued at roughly $9 billion, was accused of running its revolutionary blood testing technology on machines that didn't work as promised. The story, written by investigative journalist John Carreyrou, alleged that the company's flagship device, the Edison, produced unreliable results. Patients had received inaccurate blood test data that could have affected medical decisions. What followed was one of the most dramatic corporate fraud investigations in modern American history. At its center stood a Stanford dropout who had modeled herself after Steve Jobs, Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C. She grew up in a family with a legacy of public service and ambition. Her father worked for government agencies, including USAID, and her mother served on Capitol Hill. As a teenager, Holmes reportedly told her father she wanted to be a billionaire. She enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. She was described by professors as intensely driven and singularly focused. In 2003, at just 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford and founded Real Time Cures, which she soon renamed Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. Her vision was bold: revolutionize blood testing using just a few drops from a finger prick. Holmes cultivated a carefully constructed image. She wore the same black turtleneck every day, spoke in a notably deep voice, and presented herself as the next great Silicon Valley visionary. The media embraced her narrative completely. She assembled a board of directors that read like a who's who of American power: former secretaries of state, retired military generals, and prominent senators. Their presence lent Theranos an aura of unassailable credibility. By 2014, Holmes graced magazine covers and was celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Theranos had raised hundreds of millions in funding, but behind the glossy exterior, something was deeply wrong. Theranos claimed its proprietary device, the Edison, could run hundreds of diagnostic tests from a single drop of blood. The promise was extraordinary: faster, cheaper, and less invasive than conventional lab work. But investigators would discover the reality was starkly different. Former employees, many of whom later became whistleblowers, alleged that the Edison machines frequently produced inaccurate and inconsistent results. According to multiple accounts, the technology simply could not do what Holmes claimed. According to investigators, rather than using its own technology, Theranos secretly ran the majority of its blood tests on commercially available machines made by companies like Siemens. The finger prick samples were often diluted to create enough volume for these standard machines. The consequences were real. Theranos had partnered with Walgreens to offer blood tests at retail pharmacy locations. Patients, real people making real health decisions, received results that were, according to regulators, potentially unreliable. Some patients reportedly received false results indicating serious medical conditions they did not have. Others may have been falsely reassured. The scope of the deception extended beyond investors. It reached into the lives of ordinary people seeking medical care. Internally, the company allegedly operated under a culture of secrecy and intimidation. Employees who raised concerns were reportedly threatened with lawsuits. Theranos employed a large legal team that aggressively pursued anyone who questioned the technology. Ramesh Bhawani, Holmes's romantic partner and Theranos's president and chief operating officer, allegedly oversaw the laboratory operations and played a central role in maintaining the deception. Their personal and professional relationship would become a key element of the case. Theranos raised over $700 million from investors who believed they were funding a revolution in healthcare. According to federal prosecutors, many of those investors were given fabricated revenue projections and misleading demonstrations of the technology. The unraveling began with whistleblowers. Tyler Schultz, a former Theranos employee and grandson of board member George Schultz, was among those who raised alarms. He contacted regulators and eventually connected with the journalist John Carreyrou. Erica Cheung, another former employee, also became a key whistleblower. Both she and Schultz faced legal pressure from Theranos. Schultz reportedly described intense personal and familial pressure to remain silent. Carreyrou's investigation at the Wall Street Journal, published in October 2015, triggered a cascade of regulatory scrutiny. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services launched inspections of Theranos' laboratory in Newark, California. Inspectors found serious deficiencies. In 2016, CMS determined that the Theranos lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The agency revoked the lab's certification and banned Holmes from operating a laboratory for 2 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened its own investigation into potential investor fraud. Federal prosecutors in the Northern District of California began building a criminal case. The scale of the alleged deception was becoming clear. Investigators examined internal communications, financial records, and testimony from former employees. According to court documents, evidence suggested that Holmes and Balwani were aware of the technology's limitations while continuing to make sweeping claims to investors and the public. In March 2018, the SEC charged Holmes with massive fraud. She settled without admitting or denying the findings, paying a fine and relinquishing control of the company. But the criminal investigation was far from over. In June 2018, a federal grand jury in the Northern District of California indicted both Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The charges carried potentially decades in prison. The indictment alleged that Holmes and Balwani engaged in a scheme to defraud investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars and to defraud doctors and patients through false claims about the accuracy of Theranos technology. Holmes pleaded not guilty. Her defense team signaled that they would argue she genuinely believed in the technology and did not intend to deceive. Intent, what Holmes knew and when she knew it, would become the central question of the case. Theranos officially dissolved in September 2018, its remaining assets liquidated to repay creditors. The company that had once been valued at roughly $9 billion was now worth nothing. The revolution in blood testing had been an illusion. In the years before trial, Holmes's defense raised a remarkable claim that Balwani had subjected her to psychological and emotional abuse during their relationship, impairing her state of mind. Balwani denied these allegations. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes was set to become one of the most closely watched fraud cases in Silicon Valley history. It would test the boundaries between entrepreneurial optimism and criminal deception. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began in September 2021 in San Jose, California, after pandemic-related delays. The prosecution called former employees, investors, and patients who described being misled by Holmes's claims about the technology. Prosecutors presented evidence that Holmes had placed fraudulent pharmaceutical company logos on Theranos reports to make it appear that the technology had been validated by major firms. The companies denied endorsing or validating the Theranos system. Holmes took the stand in her own defense, a rare move in a federal fraud trial. Over several days, she maintained that she believed in the technology and had worked relentlessly to make it succeed. She described her relationship with Balwani in emotional testimony. On January 3, 2022, the jury reached its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts: 3 counts of wire fraud against investors and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to more than 11 years in federal prison. It was a landmark sentence for white-collar fraud, a signal that Silicon Valley was not above the law. Holmes reported to a federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas in May 2023 to begin serving her sentence. Ramesh Balwani was separately tried and convicted on all 12 counts he faced, receiving a sentence of nearly 13 years. The Theranos scandal fundamentally changed how Silicon Valley operates. The era of fake it till you make it encountered a hard boundary. When the product involves human health, deception carries profound consequences. Investors who lost hundreds of millions learned a painful lesson about due diligence. The Theranos board, filled with political luminaries but lacking medical or scientific expertise, had failed to ask the most basic technical questions. The whistleblowers, Tyler Schultz, Erica Chung, and others, became symbols of moral courage. They risked their careers, their savings, and their personal relationships to expose the truth. Their actions likely prevented further patient harm. The case sparked broader conversations about charismatic leadership, the psychology of belief, and how easily expertise can be sidelined by ambition and celebrity. Holmes's story became the subject of books, podcasts, and an award-winning Hulu series. Elizabeth Holmes built an empire on the promise that technology could transform healthcare. Instead, she delivered a cautionary tale that in the space between vision and reality, when honesty fails, it is always the most vulnerable who pay the price. Elizabeth Holmes is currently serving her sentence in a federal prison in Texas. She is not expected to be eligible for release until the early 2030s. The blood testing revolution she promised never materialized. A new case drops every day. Subscribe so you never miss one.